Hey there, fellas. Looks like I got myself stuck in another precarious situation. Okay, I won't do the intro skits again. Sheesh. Be thankful for God. You know, he should be thankful for me for helping clean up this fucking place. It's still a goddamn mess.
I thought it might be fun to talk about slaves.
Let's kick this thing off by asking a simple question. What is the Oregon Trail? Well, the Oregon Trail was a 2,000 plus mile long route established in the mid-19th century as a pathway from Middle America to several parts of the growing Western America. While it was originally used by fur traders for trading purposes, travel by wagon was eventually made possible, resulting in hundreds of thousands of people using the trail to emigrate out into the wild, wild west. For as exciting as that may sound, the journey was quite dangerous, what with all the waterways and mountainous areas that needed to be crossed, as well as the occasional heat wave, occasional storm, occasional wagon crash, occasional steep cliffs that the wagon would storm down and crash into. But the biggest hurdle of all were outbreaks of disease, usually cholera. By the latter half of the century, the trail found itself among many other trails leading to many other parts of the western United States that many other people would travel and settle to, before the establishment of the railroad system and ferries rendered them inefficient, although much of the trail has since been preserved as a national landmark. So that's a little history about the Oregon Trail. But what about the Oregon Trail? Well, the Oregon Trail was a text-based adventure game developed by 3 student teachers from Minnesota in 1971, namely Don Rawich, Bill Heineman, and Paul Dillenberger. It was part of an assignment Rawich had been working on late into the fall semester to teach an 8th grade class about the Great Western Journey to the West and his desire to make a more interactive experience rather than a boring group project. The game in question would put players in the role of a family making the long trek out to ye olde Oregon, managing all their food, health, and wagon, and encountering all sorts of random troubles that would teach players about the dangers one would encounter on this trail. It was envisioned as a paper and dice game before Heineman and Dillenberger hopped on to help turn it into a computer title. You may be asking, how would that work in 1971, where most computers were still these massive lumbering machines, and even the ones referred to as mini computers were still taller than the average Joe? Well, obviously, you programmed the thing in literal basic code to run off a teletype printer hooked up to one of them computers as it's connected to the school district's mainframe, or timeshare system. Here's a rough version of what that would look like in emulation form, but the real deal is like if I could hook up my keyboard to this printer and it had been programmed with this basic ass version of Oregon Trail. Like I'd type in the 1s or the 2s or the 3s or even bang and it'd print out the results. This is what they would use before monitors became a part of the standard computer setup. Huh. Weird. Anyway, it took a very fast 2 weeks, but the trio managed to get the game up and running, and it was a massive hit for Rawich's students as well as the other kids in the school. There were some complaints from teachers about how the human encounters involved skirmishes with indigenous folk, so the devs edited that language to something more generic, alongside making a bunch of other fixes on the fly. My god, this may be the first example of video game censorship. How dare they? I'm never gonna support those teletype fuckers ever again. Once that short period of playtime ended, though, the game had to be removed from the honking mainframe computer, but not before the source code was naturally printed out and kept by Rawich. So, I hope we have firmly established that this is the Oregon Trail. But now, I'm sure you're wondering, what is the Oregon Trail? Okay, get this. The Oregon Trail was a 1974 text-based adventure game that was pretty much the same as the original, but now available on school computers across the entire state of Minnesota. Shortly after graduating college, Rawich had been hired by the Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium, aka MEC, a statewide educational software development company who had been grabbing software folks like himself to help create such software for schools across the state that could be stored and accessed with their own timeshare system mainframe cloud network doohickey. Luckily, Rawich still had the code for the original Oregon Trail game in physical storage, so he punched that code into another teletype printer, polished it up, and uploaded it to MEC's network under the title Oregon. Just like the original, it was very popular among students from hundreds of Minnesota districts, being played thousands and thousands of times for the next few years. But this is where things get really interesting. MEC decided they'd had enough of these giant-ass computers and were looking to replace them with the hottest, new, tinier devices at the time. And they would get that from whoever would put in the most appealing bid. And in case you didn't know, Minnesota was once a major hotspot for the burgeoning computer industry, so they had a lot of pull there. And when one of these bids was placed by one of Minnesota's premier computer stores, Team Electronics, on behalf of a newer startup in California from two guys named Steve, the choice for MEC was obvious. Minnesota schools would be using the new Apple II computer from henceforth, and much of MEC's software would be converted to run on the newfangled machine, including the Oregon Trail. That software wouldn't be limited to Minnesotan schools either, as its popularity had been noticed by many other districts far and away from the North Star State. So MEC offered it to schools nationwide for a measly fee. Unsurprisingly, this turned a major profit for the formerly non-profit company, so MEC converted themselves into a for-profit company while continuing to expand and update their educational software well into the 80s. And with that, we have finally finished discussing the legacy of the Oregon Trail. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail is a strategy game from MEC developed for the Apple II computer in 1985. By then, Rawich had published the original source code of the game for basically anyone to use and tweak to their liking, including that Apple II version, which now had some cool graphics to go with the text. However, with the rapidly evolving technology of the time and MEC's newfound success as a functioning business, they didn't want to fall behind while they were so far ahead. So they tasked a small team of their best and brightest, spearheaded by R. Philip Bouchard, with making a new version of Oregon Trail from the ground up. Bouchard has a fascinating post on Medium where he goes in deep on the development for this title, linked in the description as well as the other sources if you'll want to check them out after this video is done. But suffice to say, this is the version that anyone who knows anything about Oregon Trail will likely be most familiar with. Now, the previously text-only game has full-color graphics, new minigames, more varied choices, and even more randomly occurring elements, more educational aspects, including descriptions for each landmark and remarks from passerby, indigenous people now being helpful allies, and of course, dysentery. Again, cholera was the main disease that killed so many people on the trail, but dysentery just sounds funnier. Now, I couldn't find exact sales figures upon the launch of this new version of Oregon Trail, but I can say, despite MEC's intentions to target the game solely for the home market, lots of schools around the country were very insistent that they include this new version as part of their licensing program. And as soon as MEC relented, the game was quickly cemented as the company's most popular title. And the series would later go on to sell upwards of 65 million copies across all versions of the game. Pretty freaking good for what started as part of a curriculum for a middle school history class. And there you have it. The Oregon Trail inspired one of the biggest migrations in American history, and one of the biggest technological migrations in American history. Oh, and MEC also established the basis for educational video games over the next few decades. Nothing super major, really, but I bet y'all are now wondering why I spent almost half of the video discussing this and not whatever the hell today's topic is. Well, the story of our topic today is the story of MEC, as Freedom was also created by those crazy Minnesotans and was also a very educationally inclined choice-based strategy game that played kinda like Oregon Trail. The key differences between the two, however, was that instead of freedom revolving around the majestic wonders of 19th century western US of A, it revolves around being a runaway slave in the dark underbelly of 19th century southern US of A and trying to seek freedom in the northern states. I'm sure any normal person would also want to know how the hell we got to this point rather than just getting to the main course right away. It's Storytelling 101, folks. And I also never knew the exact history of Mech or the Oregon Trail until now, so I thought it would be interesting to talk about anyway. But we still have a little bit more history to go through, so keep your patented wagon seatbelts buckled in tight. Man, these things are great. If only those families who got into those stupid wagon accidents while on the trail had these, they'd still be alive to this day. These fucking dumbass prairie people. Even before the Oregon Trail would go on to outsell the Street Fighter franchise, it had become a household name. Or schoolhold name, I guess. But Mech had also sold millions and millions of other products by the early 90s, and were looking to further expand their reach into that home market for realsies, as well as make games compatible with the hottest and newest computers at the time. However, the state of Minnesota could not provide them the necessary funding to get them there, so they sold off the company to a venture capital firm for a little over $5 million, and they let loose. Soon after, their output started seeing less projects like Mystery Matter and Woolly Bounce, and more projects like Snapdragon and The Secret Island of Dr. Quandary. But Oregon Trail was still their cash cow, which is how we saw spin-offs like Amazon Trail and Yukon Trail. Freedom, though, arrived before either of those two, and has a peculiar inspiration. Around this time, right smack dab in the middle of the Twin Cities, a local civil rights activist, Kamal Kambui, was in the midst of his groundbreaking Underground Railroad reenactments, where participants are put in the role of those runaway slaves for several hours. This means being blindfolded, being carefully transferred to a remote wooded location by bus, and experiencing the trials and tribulations that those slaves had to go through in trying to earn their freedom, all throughout the darkness and deadness of night. One of Mech's many designers, Rich Bergeron, found these reenactments utterly fascinating, and recruited Kamau to assist in developing a game where being a runaway slave was the focus. With a few other longtime Mech team members chipping in, Freedom was eventually released for Apple II computers in late 1992. Again, I couldn't find any sales numbers or even reviews of the game, but, well, I guarantee it did see some kind of reception indeed. So we've gone over Mech's history well enough by this point, right? But even after they've become a for-profit company, they were still mostly focused on producing quality educational games for burgeoning students, and they were very proud of Freedom. So proud that they gave the game away for free at their yearly conference. Yeah, obvious promotion tactic, but still, it must have been a big accomplishment for them if it was worthy of promoting it in that manner. And yet, developing and releasing a game centering around an extremely dour time in American history is incredibly risky, especially if they hadn't handled it with the utmost care, sensitivity, and accuracy, because if they didn't, it can easily fall apart upon scrutiny. My pasty white ass believes Mech's efforts should be commended here for taking such a risk. But a group of African American parents within the white flight created town of Maryville, Indiana, would likely disagree with that assessment. Oh dear. Around the very beginning of 1993, students in one of the city's elementary schools were provided access to this game, among many others on the school's computers, and this resulted in a fair few of the African American kids being reportedly mocked and derided by their Caucasian classmates. Those kids went to their parents, who then went to the source of the problem, before going to the teachers who allowed this game onto those devices, and then going to Mech themselves. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if there were some other districts among the thousands in the country using Mech software see this exact same scenario happen. But these specific parents caused such an uproar in reaction to the racist bullying as a result of the game's content that Mech ended up yoinking the game from their software lineup and advising any school who owned a copy to rid themselves of it at once. In their long history, Mech has put out a lot of software, but nothing like this has ever happened. So one must ask, how did a game that had the most seemingly earnest of intentions and goals cause such a fiasco? Well, you need not go too far into the game itself to find the main issue, as following the long-winded intro text about the history of your player character Slave and the generations of slavehood their family has long suffered through, we are greeted with the plantation's slave elders, who are here to help us prepare for the journey ahead. Let me remind y'all that Mech chose this game as a giveaway for their yearly conference, and this would be the first thing that they see. Now, there's obviously a bunch of very exciting directions that we could go in from here, but let's start with this dialogue. Mr. Kambui assured the developers, who then assured those parents, that this vernacular was historically accurate, and 100% how all slaves talked during this time. Even if that were 100% the case, though, which according to another expert in that field, likely isn't, the look of these NPCs would do more than enough damage to destroy any remaining credibility Mech or Kambui had in their case. You could also blame the Apple II's limited color palette for that, but I'm not sure how these fellas looked at these designs and went, oh yep, that's a sensitive portrayal, alright. It's also worth noting that one of the parents in the meeting that was organized between them and Mech to discuss a solution for this problem blatantly stated, and I quote, "Slavery was not a game in our history." So even if those stupid white kids didn't spark all of this, it was likely a matter of time before something had happened here. If I had to hazard a guess as to how that happened, this material was the most that these kids ever saw of the game, because the actual game is fucking impossible to get through. I give it a whirl alongside 3 of the versions of Oregon Trail, and while Mech Bay had prided themselves on making quality educational games, the game design has gotten significantly worse past their investment. There are definitely similar aspects between both titles, as you, again, have to manage your health, your hunger, your resources in an efficient manner, but Oregon Trail was consistently about traveling on a straight path and dealing with all of those hampering conditions along the way, whereas Freedom plays more like an open-ended dungeon crawler. You move in any 4 directions and have to either use a compass, moss on trees, or the starry sky to help navigate yourself to literally anywhere else, but the real issues pop in with all the constant harassment by those fucking slave catchers and their fucking dogs, which constantly drain your stamina and hunger and disorient your character, forcing them to constantly check up on their directions, presuming they don't get recaptured in the process. In case that weren't enough, the game also randomizes whether or not you have the ability to read, write, or swim right from the get-go, so you may not be afforded with all the skills that you might need, and every time you fail, and you will fail frequently, you need to go through these NPCs again and again and again in order to have some kind of advantage. Even the easiest difficulty is at least twice as difficult as being a farmer in Oregon Trail. And while it does help the game's case of displaying just how difficult it was for slaves to escape to the north, disregarding the problematic elements, I didn't even mention the little pose that the slave master's in, looks kind of familiar, doesn't it? Its intense challenge doesn't really offer a lot of freedom, pardon the pun. And in regards to the comments about the game at the time, I agree in this way. It doesn't seem like it'd make for the best educational tool. But Mech never intended to disregard the educational intent. I mean, look at this manual. It provides detailed, concrete instructions for how teachers should be using the game to teach their students about the subject, the assignments and questions to pose to them during that, and most importantly, how they should be in attendance during play to keep the students focused on the task at hand and not be racist little shits. The exact same supplemental setup that was used for the Oregon Trail games, both Mech's updated version and the original one from over 20 years earlier. And that was the problem. Other teachers across the country may have included freedom as part of their history curriculum for its intended use, but to those teachers in Maryville, freedom was just another piece of educational software to stick on the fiddly computer system that'll distract the kids during recess or computer time or whenever. And even then, considering other elements, I'm being generous. Like, for as popular as Oregon Trail had become, for some areas it seemed to inadvertently create this perception that all of these educational games from Mech and elsewhere could simply be played as a game rather than being part of a learning experience. And while, yeah, that can work for the most part, there's a bit of a tonal difference between kids clamoring at the computer and jawing at each other going, "Ha ha, you got dysentery," and them going, "Ha ha, you got enslaved again." Would things be different here if teachers followed the manual and used freedom correctly? Well, considering one of the suggested activities is to reenact the institution of slavery, even if the instructions urge teachers not to separate kids by race, I still think the odds that those reactions would have occurred, if not here, somewhere, were pretty high. I do maintain that the ideas Mech had for this could have worked with a little bit more time in the oven, and there are certainly worse ideas one could have in attempting to make an interactive educational experience around slavery. Okay, take that with a grain of very white salt. But I think we can at least all agree that Mech probably needed more than a singular African-American consultant to ensure a scenario like this didn't happen. Also, with how swift they were to remove the game from distribution, and the implicit trust they had with all those school districts regarding their orders to get rid of their individual copies, Mech avoided any further headaches from this big misstep. Like I said, they avoided further headaches. Mech also did their best to prevent any future headaches from occurring via their future titles, especially when crafting their millionth spin-off of Oregon Trail a few years later, which has players go on a 12,000-mile bike trek from northern Africa to southern Africa, and learning about the varied cultures and history that each country there has to offer along the way, while maintaining their team's strength and health and morale and kidney stones or something. This game was originally named Africa Trek, before a focus group they had hired suggested that it be altered to Africa Trail, as well as have them carefully go over each and every detail to ensure another Freedom kind of incident never happened again. Sadly, their untimely fate didn't lie in applying political correctness fairly, or continuing to provide good educational content for many years to come. No, it lied with capitalism. Something rather peculiar about Africa Trail was that there were two versions of the game published. One from Mech, and another from the Learning Company, which should be a familiar name if any of y'all played Clue Finders or Reader Rabbit back in the day, like yours truly did. They published a lot of games around this time, but here's something you may not know about them during the mid to late 90s, like yours truly didn't. It's the Learning Company in name only, a trade name specifically for another company named SoftKey. A bunch of business folk just shivered at the mention of that name, I can sense it. As with any company developed from notorious mogul Kevin O'Leary, they have a complicated history that is honestly worthy of its own episode, so we won't go too far with them, but SoftKey were focused more on getting that top dollar than the quality of their products, and the educational software was a prime target for them. To sum things up ever so quickly, SoftKey had acquired both Mech and the Learning Company for a near $1 billion combined sum, lost a bunch of money in the following years, and then sold themselves and everyone they gobbled up to Mattel in what's considered one of the greatest acquisition disasters, not only in entertainment, but in major business. The move crippled the educational software market for a good while, and Mech became one of its many victims in the fallout, as their main offices closed mere months before the new millennium. To think we started this off with a simple game about the American dream, and now we've ended up at the antithesis of it, with some weird dumb game about slavery caught in the middle. Thanks, Kevin, you fucking prick. Also, the more things change, the more they stay the same. To provide some closing thoughts on the main topic for this video, though, the writer for this article, a very helpful summation of the events we've discussed here, posited whether or not it would have been possible for the game to have gotten the same kind of iterative treatment that Oregon Trail did. I mean, hell, with that series, by now you can actually play as an indigenous person. And based on some of the comments that those Maryville parents made in that meeting with Mech, the main issue didn't really lie with the game itself. The true concern was how schools in the mostly white city of Maryville had a sheer lack of courses or any curriculum focused on slavery or just African American history at large. And the presence of freedom, which may have actually been one of the only sources of that at the time, just amplified the issue. Like, Freedom just ain't the story of Mech, it's the story of Maryville too. And, well, luckily the city has become much more mixed since then, to the point where the Maryville district is one of the most diverse in the entire state of Indiana. So the odds of that history now being taught in those schools in some form has to be pretty high too, right? Probably not much in other areas, especially Florida, but hey, change can happen, and has been happening, so maybe a more delicately handled attempt at this kind of concept would see the potential freedom left on the table fully realized.
In history. Each game offers a relevant story which presents central parts of the time period.
Or maybe, at least, don't let the Danish try this stuff ever again. Mech's legacy may forever be tied with Oregon Trail, but even if the risk they took with Freedom didn't pay off, it only adds to that legacy, and makes for a very weird yet very interesting wrinkle in 90s game controversies. So that's Freedom for ya, and Oregon Trail as well. But what about the Oregon Trail? Well, the Oregon Trail was released for the Wii and 3DS in 2011 to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the game, and the Oregon Trail was a mobile game released by GameBluff to celebrate the 50th anniversary.